I want to reward those who have come on time. Thank you very much for attending the Robert Heilbroner Lecture series sponsored by the Department of Economics at the New School. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to introduce the chair of our department, who will talk to us a little bit about Robert Heilbroner, and it'll make much more sense to you why we've invited Nancy Folbre to honor his memory tonight. So Will Milberg is the department head of the economics department at the New School.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you very much, and it's a great event, and I'm happy to be here and very pleased to say a word about Robert Heilbroner before we introduce tonight's speaker. Bob Heilbroner died a little over 5 years ago, after many decades at the New School, teaching and writing about the history of economic thought. Heilbroner died in 2005, and I think he would not have predicted the economic crisis of 2008, nor its aftermath. This is not a criticism of Heilbroner. By his own thinking, correct prediction was never an important criterion for what made for good economics. Heilbroner wrote that the purpose of economics was not to make predictions. It was to make sense of everyday life, to explain capitalism. The point is not that we don't think about the future. Heilbroner, in fact, called our need to think about the future a psychological necessity. So what was the role of good economics for Heilbroner? Economics, at its best, gives us not a correct prediction about the future, but a theoretical lens through which we can think about likely future scenarios to understand the limits of and the prospects for capitalism. The purpose of economics, Heilbroner wrote, was, quote, to develop a new awareness of the need for and the possibility of socially as well as economically successful capitalisms. This was the contribution of the great economists, what Heilbroner called the great centerists, or the worldly philosophers. In a 1992 paper, Heilbroner somewhat mockingly wrote, "Was Schumpeter right? No, I do not think he was." And he was, of course, mocking Schumpeter's statements about the future of capitalism and the prospects for socialism. But these incorrect predictions by Schumpeter about the role of bureaucratization as a source of capitalism's demise and of the role of leading elites in socialism's success did not, in Heilbroner's eyes, reduce the importance of Schumpeter's contribution. Schumpeter was a great economist because he understood the importance of combining history, statistics, theory, and inevitably norms and ideology in building scenarios of the future. The combination allowed Schumpeter to rethink our very notions of capitalist competition with an emphasis on technological change instead of price cutting. Heilbroner noted that the emphasis on prediction, in fact, is what got economics into trouble in the first place. And he lamented the profession's insistence on purely technical advances, what he disparagingly called science, in lieu of plausible explanations of capitalism. So Bob Heilbroner would be very pleased to know about the annual Robert Heilbroner Lecture, and not for the obvious reason. Each year we have brought before us a major economic thinker of our time to help us see capitalism in a new way, both its limitations and its prospects. And we have a prime example of that tonight, and I know we're in for a real treat. So let me turn it back to Teresa to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very much also a celebration of the tradition at the New School. I see our faculty are here. You can raise your hand. And former students of Robert Heilbroner, you can raise your hand if you want. Where we really are here to seek what is causing the crisis of capitalism and those plausible explanations. So I want to tell you about our speaker tonight. It's really not fighting what faculty do when they deliberate. Let's just call it a vigorous debate. Every year, the faculty at the New School, the economists, decide who's going to be our Heilbroner lecturer. And we started this vigorous debate on email and in the hallways about late spring. People would propose names. We would throw back biographies and analysis of why they were the perfect speaker and where they should fall in the ranking. So it just went on and on and on. Then somebody said, Nancy Folbre. She taught at the New School for a few years. We all know her. I mean, she was right in front of our face. She's everywhere. And once that name was brought up, all the debate just stopped. We found our perfect speaker to honor Robert Heilbroner. Here was a respected, qualified economist, respected in the field, and she was what people thought of when they talked about Robert Heilbroner. She was a public intellectual. She had depth of a subject, and she also understood what that subject was about, with the breadth where it fit in. We wanted someone who does economics that mattered and would speak in a way that would make the audience care. Professor Folbre, Professor Nancy Folbre, is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She received her degrees at the University of Texas, but in philosophy and also in Latin America development studies. Her research now, and has been for many decades, I've known Nancy's work for many decades, on how feminist theory can advance the study and understanding of political economy. The theme in all of her work over these decades is how the work of nurturance and caring is valued and undervalued. Her newest book is Saving State U, which is a case for strengthening the support for higher education in the United States. Education is a different form of, one form of caring. But just a year ago, she published a book called Greed, Lust, and Gender, A History of Economic Ideas. This is from Oxford University Press. And a year before that, she published Valuing Children, Rethinking the Economics of the Family, and that was published by Harvard University Press. That's 3 books in 3 years. So Professor Folbre is also a certifiable genius, having won the MacArthur Genius Award in 2007. It's a genius who also works hard. And this award recognized her creativity and her contribution to economics, and not only just a past contribution, but a promise in making a difference in our field, a breakthrough in our field. Because her work is on the very basic and important aspects of human economic activity, it is logical that the United Nations Human Development Office, the World Bank, and many other agencies that deal with poor and vulnerable people across the globe has sought her counsel. Like Robert Heilbroner, she is steadfast in a commitment to make her work accessible. She is a blogger for the New York Times. You can see her work on that webpage. It's called Economix. And I also commend her to her website, which also is a testament to her wit and her humor. Her website is called Care Talk, and that can be found on the web as well. So thank you very much, Nancy, for making your journey here to New York and for honoring us with your insights tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will and Teresa, for a really lovely introduction. It means a lot to me to be back at the New School. My first teaching job here in 1979 involved teaching at the time, what seemed like a pretty out there course called Class and Gender, and in many ways, the things I'm going to talk about tonight bring me kind of full circle. And I have to say that of all the audiences that I have ever spoken to, the audience that you represent is the one that I hold most dear. It's an audience that I think of as being committed to understanding capitalism as a system, to a deep sense of social justice, and also to a real concern with understanding current events in an often pretty puzzling and disappointing political environment. So thank you very much for being with me here tonight. I mean my title, I intend a kind of double meaning with the limits of capitalism. I intend it to be kind of a talk about the limits of understanding reality purely based on that theoretical construct known as capitalism, and the need to expand beyond that to look more specifically at gender and at unpaid work. But also as a comment on the limits of capitalism as a system, what it can and can't accomplish on its own, and where it fails us. And in talking about the current crisis, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the kind of the long-run fundamental roots of the pickle that we're in today. But I'm also going to talk, in some ways, going to focus a little bit more closely on what I see as kind of the political stalemate that we're in, and argue that feminist theory offers some important ways of understanding and unpacking that kind of political dilemma. So this image is kind of my icon. I've used it for years. It was on the cover of a book that I published in the early 90s called Who Pays for the Kids? It was designed by the Red Women's Collective in London sometime in the 80s. I've never been able to track down the actual author. It's sort of part of a folk art tradition of feminist thinking that I really hold dear. And of course, it's an image of what the work that goes on outside of the factory as the workers that come in to it and then come out of it have their capabilities developed and restored and kind of processed by women workers. As you know, women do the bulk of unpaid work, but they also are very disproportionately concentrated in the paid care sector of the economy, in education and health services, and play an especially important role in the development of our human resources. In my view, let me just first say this is, I don't want to lay claim to the feminist critique of political economy. There are many feminisms and many ways of applying feminist insights to political economy, but the version that I'm going to lay on you tonight is a critique that suggests that neoclassical economic theory is too market-centric, that it tends to view everything as though it were a market, whether it's a capitalist enterprise or a family or a household. But also, on the other side of the political spectrum, that Marxian economic theory is a little bit too capitalism-centric. And that neither of these theoretical paradigms really pays enough attention to the social organization of care work. And you'll see the influence of Marxian theory and political economy in my work, in my emphasis on political struggle, and what I will argue represents a form of collective conflict over who will pay for the costs of caring for all of us, not just the costs of raising kids, but the costs of caring for the sick, caring for the disabled, caring for the elderly, caring for people who can't care for themselves, caring for people who can't rely on the market to meet their needs. And I'm going to argue that this is a dimension of conflict that intersects with conflict over the surplus in other areas of the economy, but can't really be reduced to that kind of paradigm of the surplus itself. So I'm going to give you kind of a very broad talk. Yeah, that's the parking lot outside my local organic food store is a rich source of photographs for my PowerPoint presentation. I want to touch on some big stuff, big theory, but I also want to talk about some very specific empirical work, and then come around to the policy implications. So I'm going to give you a little dose of big theory with my perspective on the evolution of patriarchal systems, and then move to the mismeasurement of economic well-being, and then segue into the current recession, and as I emphasized, the current kind of political stalemate over how to deal with a recession. And I really want to start out by paying tribute to Bob Heilbroner. I've always thought his book, I always loved this book in particular because of its grand theoretical vision, The Nature and Logic of Capitalism. And my only quibble with it for years has been that I wanted to add that adjective patriarchal in there in the title. And so maybe someday I will kind of do that, write something with that exact title, because I love the example that Heilbroner set for all of the reasons that Will gave in his introduction. Back in the day when I was teaching class in gender, sometimes we referred to the capitalist patriarchy. And I think that's also an interesting term, but I guess I've come around to the view as time has passed, capitalism is now more the noun, and patriarchy is more the adjective than the other way around. And that's part of what I'll try to persuade you of. I think there is, to use Bob's word, I think there is a logic to patriarchal systems. I think that commitment to children and to other dependents tends to weaken women's bargaining power and to put them at a disadvantage in establishing both political representation and economic bargaining power. And I think that we can actually learn some important lessons from reproductive biology and the fact that women often have a lot to gain from marriage in terms of support for the process of raising children and raising the next generation. And I think often, as a result, end up, in many circumstances, paying a higher price for marriage or entering into a contract that is somewhat asymmetric in ways that reflect the reduction in bargaining power attendant on a greater commitment to the care of children and other dependents. This is an argument that I've made at length elsewhere, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail into it tonight, but I think it really lays an indispensable framework for understanding the evolution of social systems. I think from a macroeconomic perspective, we can kind of date the emergence of patriarchal systems with the emergence of settled agriculture and the emergence of private property, and that it generated some advantages for patriarchal societies that often allowed those societies to outcompete or in many cases extirpate societies that were not organized along patriarchal lines. There's a wonderful story about the myth of the founding of Rome, the rape of the Sabine women, that Pablo Picasso is picturing here. It's one of the most famous pictures. I mean, it's one of the most famous themes in the history of Western art. You can find 4 or 5 different versions of it from 4 or 5 different centuries in the Louvre. This is just a more recent one. It's basically a story in which the Romans, needing some women with which to found their city, came up with a very clever plan to find wives. They invited their neighbors, the Sabines, to a big party, and as soon as the Sabines arrived with their daughters, the Romans mounted a kind of sneak attack and stole the women away from the Sabines. But then they immediately married these women and got them pregnant. And by the time the Sabines had rallied to come back and reclaim their women, many of these women were bearing the children of the Roman men. And they rushed out onto the battlefield saying, "Stop, this is crazy. We don't want our fathers killing the fathers of our children." It's an incredible metaphor for the way in which women are often held hostage by their concern for their children and for the well-being of the next generation. To really make this case and develop it historically requires a lot of attention to detail, but I think there is an emerging body of feminist economic history that really fleshes this story out in some detail, the sense in which the collective interests of men and the collective interests of women were very much at odds during much of European history. The witch trials are kind of a classic example, and that's what's pictured here. I'm a particular fan of the Marxist economic historian Wally Seckham, whose account of the transition to capitalism really devotes a lot of attention to collective conflict based on gender and also based on age. And I think it's a kind of historical thesis that's gained increasing credibility in recent years. And I also think there's a kind of emerging literature on the micro foundations of patriarchal systems that often looks at efficiency wage theory or bargaining models to explain why or under what circumstances men might have an incentive to force women to over-specialize in care. There's a kind of very important literature in economic theory, the theory of the firm, that describes the capitalist as a residual claimant who gets that. Basically what that means is the capitalist gets whatever is left over after all costs are paid. That gives the capitalist an incentive to cut costs because the surplus, that which is left over, is his to claim. So a lot of Marxian literature describes reasons why this incentive structure might lead to less than efficient results. Among other things, it gives workers in the capitalist firm an incentive to shirk or to resist authority because they're simply being paid an hourly wage rather than gaining a claim over the share of the surplus. But also, it gives employers an incentive to be very cautious about any technological changes, social or political changes that might increase the bargaining power of workers. Because as the bargaining power of workers goes up, their wage goes up, and the surplus then proportionately declines. And there are many aspects of the patriarchal household that can be analyzed in similar terms. When women have very low bargaining power, men can provide them with their subsistence and claim whatever remains. And to the extent to which specialization in care makes it possible to reduce women's bargaining power, it gives men an incentive to force women's over-specialization in those activities, even when that might actually reduce the overall social product. So this is not, I'm not going to take this to any specific conclusions tonight, but I mean it kind of as a demonstration of what I see is the increasing maturation of a field of feminist economic theory that has kind of integrated itself into a larger discourse of political economy. So when I think of the interaction between patriarchal and capitalist systems, I do think of it as kind of two monsters. But it looks like they're fighting, but actually what they're doing is getting ready to mate. And of course, Mecha Godzilla, I think, is a better description of the capitalist system, a little bit less organic than the actual biological creature. And I think actually this is a metaphor that a lot of a feminist political economy has invoked, kind of the unhappy marriage of capitalism and patriarchy, or sometimes the tumultuous divorce. I guess I do think of it more as a kind of hybridization, and a hybridization that has evolved in a very complicated way over time, and which I think helps explain what's going on today. Teresa mentioned a book that I just published last year. It's kind of a history of economic ideas, and I think I want to refer you to it kind of as a longer story, a longer narrative about how long it took women to get permission to be self-interested, to pursue their own economic self-interest, whether in the economic sphere or in the sexual sphere. I think we've actually reached in the 20th century an almost gender-neutral ideology of self-interest, but it took many centuries for that kind of moral double standard to be displaced and replaced by a modern one. And I think it's a really fascinating story in and of itself. So here's how the narrative goes as I tell it. I think that the development of wage employment in particular, because it's based on individual wage work, not family work, tends to kind of undermine patriarchal relations within the family. Authority over children is undermined, importantly, in ways that are, I think, as linked to the weakening of authority over women. Women fight for and gain something that they call self-ownership, the right to control their own property in marriage, the right to control their bodies within marriage, the right to lay legal claim to their earnings in wage employment. Women engage in collective action that kind of is really necessary to move this process along. It's not, I don't want to tell this as though it's a purely economic tale about shifts in relative prices, but I think there is a sense in which the development of capitalist forces of production becomes a kind of facilitating force for the weakening of some aspects of patriarchal control. But at the same time, capitalism remains very dependent on the kinds of care that women provide, both in paid work and unpaid work. This is a famous British Airways ad, Lullaby not included. I think it's a really nice image of the way in which the maternal ideal of concern is kind of translated into a kind of picture of high quality care and solicitude for those of you that are traveling first class. And And I think the 19th century is really an incredible stage on which a melodrama is acted out of kind of compromise, of kind of collaboration between patriarchal and capitalist ideologies, with the emergence of a family wage concept that men should earn enough to be able to support a wife and children, that women don't need to earn wages as high as those of men because they don't have to support a family. The whole development of a terminology of breadwinners and homemakers that I've written about elsewhere. But I think the 20th century is a really interesting episode in and of itself because it represents the emergence of a welfare state that in many ways takes on the tasks that were once assigned to women in the family, socializing some of the costs of caring for dependents, and becoming kind of the site for the same sort of devaluation and derogation that was once leveled at women. So in my view, and this is a rather different view of the emergence of the welfare state than you'll find within the traditional kind of left Marxian account of its emergence to deal with the side effects of class struggle or the instability of capitalism. In my view, many aspects of the welfare state are basically designed to take over or to supplement functions that were once performed in families and which become basically not viable, not efficient, not effective within families. So yeah, I don't know where this came from. This is another example of kind of folk art on the web that without a it's hard to find a particular credit to give for the artist, but it shows up it's graffiti that shows up in a lot of different places. And the wrong side of capitalism here has to do with the fact that capitalism does not provide payment for services that are not bought and sold in markets. And so, since a lot of the work that women do is basically involves producing human capabilities that are not directly sold or bought, it leaves women at a disadvantage. So sure, women own themselves. This was part of the liberal rhetoric of feminism, that women would gain self-ownership. But it doesn't really take women very far if they continue to specialize in producing things that can't be owned. And I think one consequence of that is that we see with the development of capitalism a tremendous improvement in the relative position of women vis-a-vis men, but actually some deterioration often in the position of mothers relative to men and relative to other women, with increasing kind of what's been called the pauperization of motherhood or the motherization of poverty. That's particularly extreme in countries like the United States with less generous welfare states providing a substitute or a buffer for those processes. So we now live in a world in which I think it's pretty common for capitalism to be depicted in masculine terms as a kind of vital, aggressive, competitive, tough force, not just in video games, but kind of in the real world. And then the welfare state is it's actually often referred to as the nanny state, right? So it's kind of treated as the feminine side of the of that classical dichotomy. It's weak. It's innervating. It's spoiling. It's expensive. It needs to be controlled. It needs to be cut. It needs to be disciplined. And I think that this is a language that is partly a legacy of that of the kind of hybridization of capitalism and patriarchy. But it leads to, in my view, a kind of a neoliberal dilemma. It's not the only neoliberal dilemma, and it's not the only source of long-run instability of capitalism, but it is a source of instability because capitalism needs families to produce and maintain human capabilities, but it would prefer not to pay for them. In fact, it's pretty hard to organize families in a just-in-time inventory pay for performance system, although some people have theorized it, including the sociologist Coleman. I think there's an interesting analogy with the natural environment that just as as we experience capitalist competition creates some pressures to offload costs into unpriced realms because otherwise it's difficult to compete with other capitalist firms that are doing the same thing. And likewise, capitalist competition creates an incentive to exploit resources that are unpriced to the max, especially if, to the extent that other companies are doing the same thing. So it's basically a category of problem with common property, with common goods, with the commons, with what economists call externalities. And in the long run, it's not a sustainable system. That is, we can cut public higher education in the U.S. Without a lot of adverse consequences to the U.S. economy because we can outsource overseas to where there are more highly educated workers. Or in a pinch, we can always import more educated workers into the U.S. Very, very cost effective, getting the benefits of those educated workers without paying the costs. But it's a little bit of a Ponzi scheme. It's a shell game because eventually, in the long run, some country has to be producing those workers and educating them, or they're not going to be around. Okay, so that's kind of the background. That's the backdrop. That's the theory. That's the logic and nature of patriarchal capitalism. And now I want to share with you what I think are some very momentous consequences for understanding of current economic trends. I think there's a widespread awareness of the fact that we don't typically assign a value or pay much attention in our economic accounting schemes to unpaid work. But I think people tend to assume that the consequences are not all that serious. And I believe the consequences are very serious, both for understanding our economic well-being and also for understanding the political coalitions that we might hope to form and that we might depend on for some prospect for progressive change. So I want to run you through some of the ways in which the mismeasurement of economic well-being contributes to our current political dilemma. Let's start with just the simplest example. There have been many examples out there of efforts to construct a better measure of economic welfare than gross domestic product. That is, rather than just adding up the value of all the goods and services that are sold and looking at how that changes over time, that's that green line, GDP per capita going up. That's our harbinger. That's what we hear about on the news every night. That's what we're told, that when GDP declines, that means we were in a recession. When it resumes, we're out of the recession. That is our speedometer. That is our dashboard. That dominates everything that we debate in kind of economic policy on the evening news. But as we all know, there are major environmental assets and major environmental services out there that we can assign a value to that are being degraded. If we factor those in, we see a much lower rate of growth in what's called here the genuine progress indicator. The GPI is one example of a series of indices that takes environmental bads into account along with economic goods and also assigns a value to unpaid work. Well, as women enter paid work, driving GDP up, they're doing less unpaid work. That's typically not subtracted out of our economic accounting systems. But when you make these adjustments, as the framers of the GPI or genuine progress indicator have done here, you get a very, very different story. But it's even more momentous here than kind of mismeasurement of economic growth. So let me make sure that we're all on the same page about this measurement issue. I speak about this a lot, and I run into a lot of people who agree, oh, this work is so important. Oh, it's so precious. It's sacred. Of course we can never do without it. But it's not really putting a value on it. Why do that? It just... Doesn't that diminish it? What does that add? GDP isn't really about welfare. We all know that. It's just a measure of, that economists use, but we all know that it's not welfare. So, why are you trying to add in this unpaid work and pretend that it's really a measure of welfare? And, okay, I'm caricaturing a little bit, which I shouldn't, because it's actually a very hegemonic argument. And I just want to emphasize the other side. If you're interested in material living standards, the market income that you have, that you get, is a fundamental determinant of your living standards. But the time that you have to produce goods and services for your own consumption and the consumption of your family members is also an important determinant of your material living standard. In fact, you could redefine consumption, and we should redefine consumption, to mean, consumption is the sum of stuff that we buy and consume and the stuff that we consume that was produced for our own consumption. Now, this wouldn't matter a whole lot if the only unpaid work that we ever did was just for ourselves. But a lot of the unpaid work that we do is for other people. The people that we live with, the children that we're raising, the sick people that we're taking care of, the elderly that we're caring for. So there are third-party benefits. And if this labor were withdrawn, somebody would have to provide it. Else, our standard of living would decline. So I want to emphasize, this is not psychological welfare. It's not happiness. I care about those. I'm interested in those. I'm happy to talk about those. Nothing makes me happier than to talk about happiness. But this is different. This is talking about a material living standard and arguing that to have an accurate picture of it, you have to have an estimate of the value of unpaid as well as paid work. So a lot of my empirical research agenda focuses on this issue, especially time devoted to children, but I've recently been collaborating with a group of other economists and sociologists in an effort to put some better numbers on time devoted to care of the disabled and the elderly. And I want to just impress on you that the magnitudes of this unpaid labor are really high. And the accuracy of the data that we have to describe it is actually pretty good. So the American Time Use Survey, conducted every year now since 2003 as part of the current population survey, on a representative sample of the U.S. population, very high quality data. What did you do yesterday? What time did you get up? What did you do? What else did you do? What did you do then? How long did you do it? And then what did you do next? And during this time, were you responsible for the care of a child under the age of 12? It is a very, very rich data source. About half of all of the hours of work that are performed in the United States are unpaid. Now, you can call this a capitalist system. It has capitalist elements. It's a capitalist economy. But half of the work that's being done really can't be described as taking place within a set of capitalist relations of production. It has a different logic. And this work has really important implications for living standards. We know over time, the data isn't as good historically as it is in the cross-section. But we have pretty good data over time for the U.S. from some smaller surveys. And we also have good cross-sectional data from countries at different levels of development. It seems pretty clear that as countries get richer, less time is devoted to housework. But guess what? More time is devoted to children. Even in countries where women are working more in paid employment, more time is devoted to children. And the reason for that is that time devoted to children is somewhat flexible. People redeploy it. They reorganize it. So, yes, they go to work from 9 to 5. They spend more time in the evenings and more time on the weekends because time with children is irreplaceable. There is no substitute for it. Just because your child is in daycare or childcare 40 hours a week doesn't mean that as a parent you're spending less time in face-to-face interaction with your children. You're actually spending more. And I think that's a very surprising and very momentous fact, to keep in mind. We don't have sufficiently good data on time devoted to disabled and the elderly to assess those trends. So there's a question mark there. Okay, here's a little question to see. This is kind of your little quiz. to see if I've persuaded you of my argument. Take two families. Both families have 2 adults and 2 young children. Let's say they're both preschool kids, and both have a family income of $50,000. Family A has 1 wage earner working full-time, earning $50,000 a year, and 1 full-time homemaker. Family B has 2 wage earners, each working full-time, earning $25,000 per year. Those 2 families are treated exactly the same in the distribution of income. Do you think they're equally well off? No, because that family B has to pay money to purchase substitutes for the services that are being provided by that full-time homemaker. And there are a variety of ways you could put a number on the value of that full-time homemaker's services. None of them are perfect. They're all approximate. But it's really important to put some value on it if you want to understand the relative living standard of those 2 families. Okay. Here's where we're going to get a little political traction here. How many of you have heard that inequality in the U.S. has increased dramatically over the last 50 years? Okay. It's increased even more than you think it has. And here's why. Because women have entered paid employment in increasing numbers. Now, there's actually a big empirical literature that asks, what is the impact of increases in women's employment on the distribution of income? But most of that literature, all of it, really, pretty much, until like the last 2 years, just looks at market income. What happens to the distribution of market income when women enter paid employment? Well, that can work either way. It's actually kind of an interesting empirical question because women enter paid employment. That brings up their family income. Well, it depends how many do it at what time and to what extent high-earning women marry high-earning men. That in itself could have an equalizing effect or a disequalizing effect. I think that the most persuasive empirical work on this, just market income alone, suggests that it's had an equalizing effect. That is, that market income is now distributed more equally as a result of women's entrance into paid employment. But that's because you were taking all these women who were not in market employment before and giving them 0 contribution. All those homemakers and housewives got 0. So when women did paid employment, moved into paid employment, that's equalizing the distribution of market income. What if you go back in there and assign a value, impute a value to that non-market work, and then you're asking not what happened when women started working, but when women changed the kind of work they did, right? They changed the kind of work they did from doing unpaid work as homemakers to doing paid work in the wage labor market. And just think about it. There's a lot more variation in wages in the labor market than there is in the productivity of women. I mean, the productivity of nursing a child, it doesn't go up a whole lot with a college degree. There are some differences in child rearing and housework. Okay, you can be a gourmet cook. If you have a great vocabulary, maybe your children will do better on their SAT scores. And I'm not pretending that those differences aren't significant. I'm just saying, in general, women's unpaid work was of much more similar value than women's paid work. And so as you move from an economy in the 1950s where a lot of women are full-time homemakers to one where the percentage of women who are employed is very close to 50% of all employment today. A lot of that's part-timers, but still an amazing transformation. You see that the overall difference in living standards has almost certainly become really much more unequal than a measure based on market income alone. Another way to see that is sort of patriarchy was kind of equalizing the capitalism. Every man had a housewife. If every man had a housewife who earned about the same, then every man is sort of adding an equal amount to their living standard over time. So I got ahead of myself. I've done a little, let me just say, I'm oversimplifying here a little bit because how you measure inequality matters. There are a lot of different metrics you can use, whether a Gini coefficient or a decile measure or a variance measure, and you could get into some really interesting technical stuff. But I believe there is some pretty good evidence that inequality has moved in this direction. And plus, over the same time, the cost of caring for dependents have gone up. The cost of childcare, if you're engaged in paid employment, the cost of sending children to college, and the importance of sending children to college has gone up. The increased longevity of the older generation. And now, with lower fertility, we have fewer siblings with whom to share elder care responsibilities. So this is also a determinant of your living standard. How many dependents are you caring for, and how much do those dependents cost? You know, we have a food price index, we have a consumer price index. We do not have a dependent cost index. If we did, it would show that the cost of caring for dependents has increased over time. So what does that mean? Well, I have argued for a long time that we have some very important potential political coalitions to build in this country around public support for family care, both in the form of tax credits and public support for caring for dependents, the provision of public services, work-family balance issues like improving part-time jobs. And in fact, we've seen some important gains in this area, including unpaid family leave. But I think that what's undermining this effort is the increased inequality that has been exacerbated by changes in women's roles. So high-wage women now have this picture of the capitalist system, this picture of the wage pyramid, is much more complicated because it's not just about the distribution of income or the distribution of wealth. It's also about the distribution of the costs of caring for dependents. And that has become more unequal and more fractured and more divisive. It's made it very difficult to unify women, I think, around a kind of systematic political agenda. At the same time, I think the deterioration of our overall living standards and decline in relative wages has increased people's anxieties about the welfare of their children, the competitiveness of their children, and in ways that I think make it difficult to build a strong coalition around improving educational opportunity and health. And I think that is, I think that's very relevant to understanding the current political situation. If all that was going on in our current polity was a concentration of wealth and income at the very, very top, with everybody else getting worse off, it's very hard to explain why we wouldn't have a stronger political coalition willing to argue for higher tax rates on families with incomes over $10,000 or $50,000. I think the American working class and middle class is divided in some very profound ways along family structure lines, along class lines, along lines of race and ethnicity. This isn't just this isn't the only factor contributing to our current political dilemma. There is obviously a huge backdrop. There's the effect of deregulation on a global level. There's the reduced importance of national boundaries and loyalties. There's control of the media and corruption of democracy. We've moved towards a more competitive form of capitalism. That's what globalization is doing. And that competitiveness, that competitive pressure is disrupting a lot of welfare state dynamics. But I do think these factors I've put here in red are also part of the story, that there's increased inequality among women and families. There's increased conflict over the welfare state, the cost of social reproduction. And I think that that is contributing to a fear of collective action and an opposition to social spending. So there's some painful but profound ironies with this. First, I have to share with you my favorite cartoon, which I show in virtually every PowerPoint presentation I ever give, thanking the cartoonist Norman Dogg for letting me do it. What is happening with this hybrid system as it's evolving is that global capitalism itself is undermining a lot of the values that are really central to family life. The idea of pursuing your own self-interest, the idea that commitments are for suckers, the idea that you don't really need to share, the idea that caring for people makes them dependent and undermines their self-reliance is a very anti-family ideology. And so this kind of summarizes it for me. We're shipping you to Mexico. It's more cost effective to raise you there. Of course, people don't yet shipped children to Mexico, but what we have done is shipped Mexican workers here, which kind of amounts to the same thing. I think there are some interesting twists to the story and some incredible ironies. And one thing that's happening is that we've seen, as a result of the current crisis, a tremendous increase in unemployment among men in particular. Layoffs were much more significant among men than women. And there's been a lot of discussion in the media about the man session. Have you heard this term, the man session? That in the business cycle, because men are employed in more cyclical industries like manufacturing, when we hit a recession, men lose their jobs faster. But of course, if it were just the business cycle, then men would gain jobs faster on the other side. But guess what's happening in this recession? There's no upturn in employment. There's no recovery in terms of jobs. And so what we're seeing are some longer run trends. And these longer run trends, I think, are really illustrated very nicely in this graph that's just showing, comparing employment in manufacturing since 2000 with employment in health and education services. The reason why these industries are interesting to me is that they start out about the same numbers and pretty close. And look at that divergence. Manufacturing employment is almost 75% male, and health and education services employment is almost 75% female. So we're going to see a lot of pressure on gender roles coming about as a result of this feminization of the structure of employment. It's also reflected in these trends in labor force participation, where now you can see that the participation rates of women with a bachelor's degree or better are actually higher than those of men with only a high school diploma. So it's not just unemployment that we have to worry about, but a real decline in the ability to get jobs and participate in the paid labor force that has very, very damaging consequences for families and for overall inequality in the U.S. So this is my punchline. If I think that one political effect of increased inequality among women is pretty apparent in the success of the Tea Party and the media play that its advocates have gotten. And I think an even more disturbing possibility is that we're seeing this persistent unemployment and lack of employment at the bottom of the income distribution is going to have huge legacy effects. It's going to have horrible consequences for the next generation growing up in poverty and unable to fully develop the capabilities that they need to compete in today's economy. And that leaves us with some really important political priorities. We really need to publicize and protest current unemployment rates. They're inefficient, they're wasteful, they're unsustainable, they're unacceptable. They are testimony to the failure of market forces to rescue us from this recession. We really need to document increased inequality, and not just inequality in market income, but inequality in living standards. And in particular, the inequality suffered by women raising children on their own in an economy where they can't find jobs and the fathers of their kids can't find jobs either. And our task has got to be to measure and explain those social costs in ways that can overcome these divisions, in ways that can rally a larger coalition that could help us move towards a more sustainable organization of production and a more sustainable organization of our social reproduction. Thank you very much. I hope you'll have some comments or questions. I've been asked to have you raise your hand and then get a microphone before you speak.
Hi, my name is Lee Wang. I have a question, and that is, if we're experiencing such high unemployment rate, why aren't there any people going out on the street to protest? Look at what is happening in London. The people, actually the students particularly, are very upset about the increment in tuition But why aren't we doing this? Why isn't there anyone going out on the street and protest? Okay, that's my question.
I don't know. I think that I wish I did. I think that a lot of it has to do with kind of the psychology of recession and the psychology of people blaming themselves and blaming their own. I don't know. It just has something to do with. I think the only way you can explain it is by describing kind of a structure of political fragmentation and a lack of understanding of market failure that could prevent people from kind of mobilizing themselves and others. Maybe others want to give this question a try.
Hi, I'm Heidi Siegfried, and me and Noreen Connell, who's a past president of now New York State, and Chuck Bell from the National Jobs for All Coalition, we just started a first Friday vigil for jobs at Chuck Schumer's office from 12:30 to 1:30, and the first one we had was December 3rd. The next one will be January 7th, and this is when the unemployment statistics come out. And they were supposed to be flat this month, but they went up 2 points. So, and we got a little bit of coverage in El Diario and different. But we want to continue to build this, and by having it be a regular first Friday, 12:30 to 1:30 at Chuck Schumer's office. And, you know, we may have different themes and, you know, but... And this is happening... Oh, Chuck Schumer's office is on 3rd Avenue around, like, 47th or something like that. And other cities have similar kind of protests, usually Jobs with Justice or, you know, different people. But, you know, it's hard to get coverage. And then the other thing is there are a couple of... There's the 99ers, and there's UWAG, Unemployed Workers Action, and these are people, you know, actual unemployed workers who do things that are more like flash mobs, and you know, they do these creative things that use the social media. But that's all I know about right now.
I think. Hi, Nancy. Rick McGahee was one of those long time ago students. This is a fascinating analysis. Our head is spinning. So I want to go back to this idea that, particularly with the aging of the population, you've got this huge cost of social reproduction that's not being met, actually, that all the claims on the government budgets are saying is going to get worse.
Right.
Yet from your presentation, as women continue in the workforce, it seems very hard to kind of pull on that cord. So if you could just try and spin that out some. Quality of care declines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I was really struck by this idea that these social costs of reproduction just aren't in a family with children, but really bringing this idea of the dependence. Do you know, are there organizing things among that coalition of workers? But also the consequences for the economy if that doesn't go. Can capitalism just kind of keep dumping that cost out?
Well, good question. I guess we'll find out as we age. But it is real testimony to it is real testimony to kind of political divisions, because you would think that with a growing cohort of people who are moving towards old age, that and a declining supply of unpaid labor available to help tend to that, you'd think there would be a greater interest in collective mobilization in that direction. And I think there is. I think that support for Social Security remains pretty strong among voters. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion and debate about pension reform that Teresa could weigh in on and talk about. But the weak spot in the whole elder care scenario has been paying for long-term care, and the health insurance bill included a private insurance program, the Class Act, that could turn into a cost-effective way of financing long-term care, but it seems increasingly unlikely that it will do that. So it just seems to be the case that people are weighing the two possible strategies, and one strategy is It's kind of a cost-benefit analysis. Am I better off increasing my own savings and fighting for lower tax rates and just trying to take care of myself and my own family, or am I better off pooling risk in this public insurance system? And as you know, there's a giant amount of ideological warfare against the idea of pooling. And I think that our task really is to take that on. And I mean, our task as economists is to really show the tremendous efficiencies that can be gained through an effective risk pooling system, which is what public insurance is. And I really think the economics profession in the United States deserves some of the blame for kind of a methodological and theoretical bias that's made it very difficult, that hasn't encouraged that kind of research.
Hello, thanks. I just want to thank you for your presentation. That was great. My name is Sunshine Letter, and I'll just quickly try to add, as you were saying, to the response to why aren't people on the streets, maybe one other element. I mean, this is just something I've thought about, is the increasing criminalization and state violence towards street assembly and protests that we've seen, at least I've seen over my lifetime. I don't know if that's one element possibly adding to just not having a desire to throw out into the streets, because the consequences are becoming more and more severe. But two questions I had for you. One was the Tea Party mention. Mm-hmm. I was just curious about a little more explication about your thoughts of how this connects, the details of how this connects to your thoughts about the Tea Party movement. And the second question I have, which is a different question, is your thoughts about political strategy around the alternative economic measures. I've thought some about the alternatives to GDP, like meaning getting them actually used in public and media discourse, et cetera. Yeah.
I think the Tea Party, there's been some debate over what percentage of members of the Tea Party are women. There was an article published last spring claiming that 55% of its members were women. I don't put much, I think it's very ambiguous how you define Tea Party membership, much less figure out its demographics. I do think understanding the demographics is pretty important. But I think the political visibility of women in the Tea Party in the last elections was really striking. And that a lot of women, and I think Sarah Palin among them, really do have a pretty strong following among women voters. And I think that following is really based on a very anti-state, very, very kind of, we're better off taking care of our own families and not having to worry about other people's families, is very much a part of the. I mean, they don't say that, but I think that is kind of the subtext of what they're arguing. It's very strongly anti-tax. It's very strongly anti-government spending. It's opposed to health insurance. It's very targeted at the welfare state, and I guess that's why in some ways that's kind of what inspired this talk, is that I felt like, gosh, there must be something going on that can explain this particular fractionation that is going. Now, it may not persist. I hope it doesn't. I think these political coalitions are very unstable right now and very tippy. I don't know where the future lies, but I am pretty sure that class and race conflicts are greater now among women than they were 25 years ago.
What do you think it is? Can you respond to the GDP measure?
Oh, yeah, sorry. There are a lot of people working on alternative GDP measures. There's actually, the Bureau of Economic Analysis is open to the idea of developing satellite household accounts. I don't exactly understand why they haven't gotten more traction. It's partly because there's a proliferation of them and people can't decide among them. And so that indecision makes that GDP remains this focal point. There's just a lot of inertial momentum behind GDP. I guess I just feel like more people should say no to GDP. Call up and let's have protests. Let's have street protests against GDP. I mean, people should just be writing in and saying, GDP, this is a bogus measure, why are you using it? I mean, to say the recession is over with unemployment over 9% and going up, what's wrong with that picture, right? To say that a recession, that we should define the business cycle in terms of the rate of growth of this construct that's really been, in many ways, successfully challenged among economists and social scientists, yet it just remains the arbiter. I don't know. We really need to rally around that. Someone asked me about why is there more race and class inequality among women? Well, part of it is the success of feminism within a capitalist system. It's that hybridization. It's that interaction. That women have gained more education, women have moved into professional managerial jobs, and a lot of women have not. A lot of women are at the very bottom of the income distribution in low-wage childcare, elder care, retail jobs. So the inequality of earnings among women is much greater than it was then. And in my view, inequality matters. Inequality affects people's decisions about whether they want to pool risks with other people, whether they want to redistribute income with other people, whether they want to join up with other people. The problem is, of course, is that inequality breeds inequality. And it becomes a circular process, very, very difficult to interrupt. It has its own momentum that we really need to understand better in order to combat it.
One reason that GPI is not in the lexicon is that women's poverty is not in the lexicon. Single women and elderly women generally live in poverty. But when President Obama talks of his commitment, he talks of his commitment to the middle class.
That's true. And I think it's because he, I think that the kind of fracture of collective interests in the U.S. today has people hoping to make an alliance with people above them at the expense of people below them. And I think people are terrified at what's happening globally. They see that the U.S. is losing its position in the global economy. They see that real wages have basically stagnated for most workers, and certainly for workers without a college degree. And they see very little potential to change the overall structure of inequality. In that environment, I think their instinct, their impulse, their affinity is to try to identify with people above them rather than people below them. And what can we do except try to understand that and try to talk them out of it and try to reconfigure it and try to give them an expanded sense of possibilities and potential for reorganizing things in a more sustainable and egalitarian way.
But I mean, if you say, like, to name it is to claim it, it hasn't even been named.
Well, it's not that it's not named. I mean, people go around naming it all the time. It's just that they don't get traction. They don't get people behind them. You can find a lot of. I mean, I've been writing about poverty among mothers for 25 years without getting very much attention either in the media or in the economics profession. It's not that people don't. It's not that there aren't numbers, that there's not research out there. It's that there's not rage. There's not rage out there about it.
People don't realize even that the tax cuts are affecting them.
Yeah. I think that people with the mics, if you want to speak, you have to get the attention of the people with the mics because they're the ones who are kind of controlling the process. That's kind of the technology.
Hello? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Roslav. I'm a student over at Parsons, and I particularly wanted to ask some questions about this notion of unpaid work in response and kind of to a project that's currently run at Parsons called the DESIS Lab. And so one of the things that we studied over the summer was this concept of social innovation, which begins to happen when traditional kind of systems begin to collapse and fail. And so the project that I worked on over the summer was the kind of beginning of the demise of what you could say the Lower East Side elderly healthcare system and the closing of the senior centers that happened as a response of funding cuts from Albany. And so one of the things that we were studying was the ways in which social innovation, which is how small communities then begin to self-organize and solve kind of their own problems. We went around looking at what was happening. And then one of the professors who was, you could say, doing research on the project gave a critique that I thought was kind of very frightening in thinking about this, which is that as more and more people kind of stop relying on what you could say the welfare state and the government and funding comes out and they start solving their own problems, what incentive is there left for government to then bring that back in? And so then what happens when people start solving their own problems and kind of without the support of money, how do we then maneuver that when that gets back? And is there anything that can be said about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess personally I feel like I wish we had that problem. That is, if I thought people could self-organize their way out of the shortage of elder care and poverty, I would be a happier person. And probably stop being an economist and do something a lot more fun. I do think that self-organizing is very powerful and that there is a lot of potential there, but I think it needs to be combined with public support and risk pooling and public insurance. And hopefully, we all can learn something. Even from our worst failures. And I think new ideas are often born out of necessity. So I guess I'm very enthusiastic about efforts that are kind of more decentralized, self-organized efforts, not just for elder care, but also for developing cooperative businesses and developing more community-based economic development streams. I think there are a lot of ideas that we can be pursuing and developing, but I don't think any of them are going to be successful without some public commitment to supporting them and encouraging them. So I really like the description of what you're doing, and I think I hope it turns into a really good, healthy, successful, good hybrid.
Oh, go ahead. You could do it. Go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. It was really great. I just wanted to get a clarification because you went over your interpretation of the welfare state as it differs from others really quickly.
Yeah.
So if you could just expand on that for a second. You were kind of saying that you didn't agree that it was the outcome of class struggle, but that it had some functionalist kind of dynamic to it. So if you could just kind of elaborate on that, I think it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I guess I do have a kind of headlong tendency as a speaker. So let me backtrack a little bit. I think there are a lot of reasons why the welfare state has emerged in all of the advanced capitalist countries. And I think part of it has to do with regulating market failures, including the kind of failure of the financial system that we've just lived through is really a crucial part of state regulation. I think regulation of environmental travesty is also a really important explanation of state action. I think unemployment insurance in particular, as it emerged in the 1930s, was very much driven by class conflict and fear of the tremendous instability that resulted from high unemployment rates. But I also think that if you look at a lot of what we spend money on in the welfare state, a lot of it is caring for children and the elderly. And a lot of it is caring for children and the elderly in a better way than families could do on their own, providing education, providing health, providing services that are far superior in quality and much more cost effective than what we could do on an individualized family basis, and also just better from an insurance point of view. I mean, sure, you can rely on your children to support you in old age. Good luck. If your children come to New York and go to the New School and become artists, or even economists, you're going to have to get a pretty big chunk of their paycheck to pay for your own food. People can't. There are just. I think that there are tremendous economies of scale and economies of scope in social insurance, so I guess I kind of cringe at the word functionalist. Maybe there is a little bit of a functionalism there, and the idea that I think it fulfills a function. But I think people fought for it and expanded it because they felt that it improved our collective standard of living, and that there just needs to be some appreciation of its connection to families and to unpaid work in the whole story, and that's often lost in the kind of classic literature on. In political economy, on the emergence of the welfare state, you will not find mention of the word family. In fact, a lot of textbooks of public finance try to look up women or family in the index, and you won't find it. It's as though it doesn't exist. It really has been rendered pretty invisible within that field of economics.
Hi, Nancy, Larry, and Angelo. I think the lack of rage and the Tea Party as well is a function of the fact that we haven't called the question yet because we haven't balanced the budget. So, Obama comes in, he takes office, money flows to states and localities. There are minimal layoffs in just those areas, education and health. So we got through that one for a couple of years. The Democrats lose the midterm election. There's a lot of rhetoric about how much we hate all these services. Nonetheless, you're not seeing a lot of cuts yet. And if the last round is any indication, when you want tax cuts for the rich and an extension of unemployment, you basically get both. And you just let the deficit increase. Now, you can't do that forever, but so far, we've gotten through with only minimal irritation because we have been willing to allow the deficit to grow. Now, a Tea Party local guy in Nassau County basically did the same thing. He did tax cuts, did not cut the budget, and they're in bankruptcy. So, I don't know where it'll end, but as of right now, we'll just, let the deficit rise and just see how things go. And that may change once we can't do that anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of like Ponzi. It's like Ponzi political finance. It's like instead of Ponzi finance, you see these political problems coming, and you just figure out a way to move them into the future, right? And it may well be that that's what we're doing, and that the day of reckoning has just been postponed. I think that's a very interesting hypothesis, and I hope it's true.
Well, speaking of the day of reckoning, first, thank you for that wonderful and lucid analysis, which I totally share and agree with. And then my question is maybe the $64 eternal question, but it goes to the heart of how the Tea Party has stolen the rhetoric, and what you think about the way you talked about rage and terrifying, and those words that really do get to the heart of the matter, and how has terror, the security state, the fear mongering that is full time by the government as much as other sources, rerouted the analysis to be one that's about securing our own individual future, our own individual child's future, rather than a social kind of solution or pooling the risk, as you framed it.
It's sort of like the Titanic. It's like playing table tennis on the Titanic. It's just really hard to see. You're on a boat. You can't really, it's dark. You can't really see where you're going. You can't see the icebergs. In theory, they're there. What you see is that you're competing with someone in the stateroom, and they're winning, and and you want to drink, and it's just less visible. And I think that is there's a whole history of human responses to catastrophic events that suggests that that's a pretty endemic problem. So how do we do it? How do you shine a light on it? How do you make it visible? I think it's a task that requires, unfortunately or fortunately, or neither one, I don't know. Economists don't really know how to do this. Like, what we're talking about it's not really about economics. It's about communication. How do you communicate to people? How do you give them a picture of what of the dark waters and of the risks of running full speed ahead with this misplaced confidence in what we're doing? I think that's something that we all have to turn ourselves to and think about. But it's not something that I feel like I have any great special expertise in doing.
I think it's also a question for all of us to have not the dark waters, but a different shore.
Yeah.
To say.
Well, there you go.
Something else to go for.
That's right.
And that, I feel like a reduced work week where more people work. Reduced work hours. It's kind of simple, but impossible. But to have a different vision of it, I'm not asking.
Yeah. No, I like the different shore metaphor. I think that's good.
I'm not an economist, I'm an historian, but I read Paul Krugman, where I get most of my economics from until I come to wonderful things at the New School. But isn't he saying very much what we've just been talking about in this last 10 minutes about the shore that's there and nobody is looking at it, nobody seems to be caring about it?
Yes.
We're going to pay the price, and our children are certainly going to pay the price.
Yes, I would say that my assessment of in particular the tax deal that the Democrats just signed on to and what its consequences will be politically in the long run, I very strongly agree with Krugman on that. Yes.
Hi, my name is Marion Lipschitz. I graduated with a master's degree in anthropology from the New School in 1981. I think your analysis was terrific and very relevant to me since I'm currently underemployed. But I'm going to shift the context a little bit back to globalization and neoliberalism, because I recently went to a human rights conference. It was sponsored by Rabbis for Human Rights North America, and it put my own dilemma into a rather different context, because one of the plenary sessions talked about there was the fact that there is now more slavery in the world than ever before, including more than when we had 19th century chattel slavery in this country, that it is having disproportionately horrible effects on the lives of women and girls who get forced into trafficking. And I'm just wondering if you could comment as an economist, because some of the solutions that were proposed at that conference about corporate social responsibility and microcredit and allowing, a little girl to raise a cow so that someday she would then have a herd and it would lift up the whole village seem to me not to be sufficiently comprehensive.
What is your own vision of what should happen?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I would say my own economic philosophy is social democratic or democratic socialist. I think that you were certainly going in the right direction when you talked about women's unpaid labor. I think what I'm saying is partly on the heels of what one of the previous questioners talked about in terms of fear-mongering and the erosion of civil liberties and the erosion of human rights as a consequence of with globalization. More, maybe a revolution at the World Bank, because their thinking on this hasn't been very adequate either.
I guess I feel like anything that we can do to try to develop a more collaborative and cooperative and sustainable set of economic policies in the United States could also potentially have positive effects in challenging the kind of downside of global neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
But I take your point that we need to be thinking not just about ourselves, but about the world as a whole. And there are a lot of symptoms of increased conflict and increased instability on a global level that are very disturbing.
Nancy, I just want to say thank you to you, and you can tell that your subject brought a lot of breadth to the questions. Is there any question you'd like to ask yourself to bring your talk to a close?
No, thank you all very much for coming, and I've been able to talk with you.